Okay, today's lesson is writing rules for linear functions. Today we have some new vocabulary. Our first new vocabulary word is function notation. And function notation is when you're writing an equation or a function. Equation and function are the same thing. You can use f of x instead of y. So we're used to seeing equations in the form of y equals 2x plus 3. It can also be written in function notation by saying the function of x, or f of x, equals 2 plus 3. The second term is a function rule, and that is an equation that describes a function. Both of these things that I have written up here are both function rules, otherwise known as an equation. Just like I showed you up here that I used y, or I could use f of x, or the function of x, is exactly the same as y. So all equations can be written using the function of x or y. For example, these are both function rules. Y equals 3x plus 2 and f of x equals 3x plus 2. Both are the exact same rules. So now we're going to learn how to write rules for functions. The first type that we're going to look at are functions that are written in a table. So the first thing, the steps that we need to follow, number one, is determine the pattern. How does y or f of x change as x changes? The pattern is going to be the slope. And then the third thing is we need to find the starting point, and this is the y or f of x value when x is equal to 0. And the starting point is always going to be the y-intercept. So first of all, let's determine the pattern. How does f of x, or remember this is the same as y, how does it change as x changes? So first we want to look at how does f of x or y change. So I ask myself, what do I add to 5 to get to 1? I know that I have to add positive 6. Then I ask myself again, what do I add to 1 to get to 7? And I know I add 6. And what do I add to 7 to get to 13? I know I add 6. So I know that y changes every time by adding 6. Now I'm going to ask myself, how does x change? Well, when I go from -2 to 0, what do I add? Positive 2. And when I go from 0 to 2, what do I add? Positive 2. And when I go from 2 to 4, what do I add? Positive 2. So I know that this change, or this pattern, is actually the slope. Remember, we use the letter M for slope, and to find the slope, it's always your change in y over your change in x. So we just found that when we found the differences in this table. So we know the slope is equal to 6 because that's the change in y or f of x, and the change in x is 2. So 6 over 2 reduces to 3. This is the slope. I'm going to circle this just so I remember it for later. Now the third thing is to find the starting point, and this is when the y, what the y value is when x is 0. So in the table we see that when x is 0, y is 1. This 1 here is the y-intercept, where the line crosses the y-axis. So we remember from yesterday's lesson, an equation in slope-intercept form looks like this. Y equals mx plus b. X and y are these points that are on the graph. So the only thing we need to fill in is the slope and the y-intercept. So we would write this equation, y equals, remember I circled the slope up here so I would remember it, 3x plus the y-intercept, which we identified right here as 1. So the function or the rule for this table is y equals 3x plus 1. What I would like you to do is try these next 3 problems on your own. You can pause the video right now, and when you're finished with these 3 problems, writing the rules, you may turn back on the video and I will be here to explain how to do these. Okay, welcome back. I hope you had enough time to finish your 3 problems. So let's look at the first one. The first thing that we want to do is find the slope. So we need to see how f of x or y changes as x changes. So when I look here at the table, I see that I add 2 each time to get to the next number for y. And in the x, what do I add to -1 to get to 0? I realize that I add 1. And from 0 to 1, I add 1. And from 1 to 2, I add 1. So remember the slope is equal to the change in y, which is 2, over the change in x, which is 1. Or the slope is just equal to 2. So I'm going to circle that to remember for later. Now, the y-intercept is when x is 0, the y value. So this 0 here is the y-intercept. So I know b is equal to 0. So when I write the equation for this line, it's y equals mx plus b, and I'm going to replace m and I'm going to replace b with the y-intercept. So y equals, the slope is 2x plus the y-intercept is 0. And actually, we can really write this equation as y equals 2x. We don't have to include the 0. Let's look at the second example. How does f of x, or remember that's the same as y, change? I see that to get from 6 to 0, I have to add 6. And, oh, excuse me, not add 6. I would add -6. And to get from 0 to -6, I add -6. And the same thing here. I'm going to add -6. Now I look over here. What do I add to x to get to 0? Or what do I add to -3 to get to 0? I add 3. And from 0, I add 3 to get to 3. And again, I add 3 to 3 to get 6. So when calculating the slope, it's always the change in y, or f of x, which in this case here we see is -6 over the change in x, which we see is +3. When we divide that, we get a slope of -2. I'm going to circle that for later. Now, the next thing we need to find is the y-intercept. Remember, we always look for when x is 0, and the y value when x is 0 is going to be the y-intercept. And in this case, it's 0 again. So when we write the equation y equals mx plus b, we are going to replace m and we will replace b. So y equals, the slope is -2x. Now look at here. Remember the y-intercept here is 0. In this last equation over here, when the y-intercept was 0, we didn't have to write that down. So we won't write that down in this equation. So the equation for this table is y equals -2x. So let's look at the final table and write a rule for this. So how does y change? What do I add to -11 to get to -7? +4. I add +4 to -7 to get -3, and I add +4 to -3 to get 1. Now I want to look and see how y changes. What do I add to -6 to get -4? +2. What do I add to negative 4 to get negative 2? Positive 2. And what do I add to negative 2 to get 0? Positive 2. Now we're ready to calculate the slope. What is the change in y? 4 over the change in x, which is 2. So the slope, when we divide that, is equal to 2. Circle that for later. Now we're going to look at what is the y-intercept. We identify where 0 is. The y value is 1, so that means the y-intercept is 1. So we're going to write our equation, y equals mx plus b, and we will substitute m, the slope for m, in the y-intercept for b. So it's y equals 2x plus 1. This here is the equation for this table. Now we're going to learn how to write rules from graphs. So remember, the two things we need to identify when we write an equation in slope-intercept form is the slope and the y-intercept. When we look at a graph, it's pretty easy to see the y-intercept because it's where the line crosses the y-axis. And the line crosses the y-axis at this point, which is negative 1. Now to find this slope, we're going to use the stair-step method that we used a couple of days ago in class. So we make our stair and we look at the rise over the run. So we run 1, 2, 3, 4 to the right. Because we're moving to the right, that's positive, and we rise 1, 2 up. Because we're moving up, that's positive. So remember, slope is rise over run, which means the rise, or the up and down movement, is 2, and the run, the left or right movement, is 4. We can reduce that to 1/2. So now we know the slope and the y-intercept. We can take our equation, y equals mx plus b. We replace the m with the slope, and we replace b with the y-intercept. So we take what we just found up here. The slope is 1/2. We replace that with m times x plus the y-intercept, which is negative 1. We can also write this as y equals 1/2 x minus 1. Either one of these rules would be correct. So here's two examples, or two practice problems that I would like you to try on your own. And you can pause the video for a minute while you do these problems, and when you're ready, hit play, and I'll be back to show you how to do them. All right, let's look at this problem. Remember, the two things we need to identify are the slope and the y-intercept. So the y-intercept, very easy to find. Where does that line cross the y-axis? And that's at 1. What's the slope? We're going to make the stair step, and we move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 places to the right, so that's positive 5, and 1, 2 places up. So the slope is 2/5, and we want to keep that as a fraction and not change that to a decimal. So when we rewrite the equation, y equals mx plus b, we're going to replace m with the slope and b with the y-intercept. So y equals 2/5 x plus 1. That is the rule for this graph. Now let's look at this graph. Again, we need to identify the slope and the y-intercept. The y-intercept is where the line crosses the y-axis, which is at 2. And if we make our stair step to find the slope, we will find that we move 1, 2, 3, 4 down. Because we're moving down, that is negative, and we move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the right. So the slope is rise over run, which is negative 4/5. So when we write our equation, y equals mx plus b, we will substitute in the slope in the y-intercept. So y is equal to negative 4/5 x plus 2. And this is the rule for this graph. Well, I hope that you have a better understanding of how to write rules for both graphs and tables. And if you have any questions, you can ask them to me in class tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.